What if I told you that over 2,000 years ago, one man mapped out almost every branch of human thought, from biology to politics, from the mysteries of the mind to the logic that still underpins science today? He created a framework so enduring that we still rely on it without always knowing his name. This man was Aristotle. But how does someone reach the point of shaping knowledge itself? To understand the system he built, you first need to meet the person behind it, a student, a teacher, and ultimately, an architect of thought. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we begin, just a quick housekeeping note. If you enjoy what I'm doing, a like and subscribe would be really helpful. It goes a long way in keeping the channel going. And don't forget to drop a comment. I'd really love to know what you think. Aristotle's life begins in the northern Greek town of Stagira, a coastal settlement far from Athens' bustling philosophical circles. His father, Nicomachus, served as a physician to King Amyntas of Macedon, so from birth, Aristotle was connected to both royalty and a practical, observational tradition of medicine. In his household, the body was understood not through ritual or magic, but through the study of its functions and imbalances. Patterns in nature could be observed, described, and corrected. Growing up in this environment, Aristotle would have absorbed the idea that knowledge relies not only on stories or tradition, but on careful attention to the real world. This grounding in medicine and observation prepared him for the intellectual path he later followed. As a young man, Aristotle left Stagira and traveled to Athens, then the center of Greek learning. There, he joined Plato's Academy, a community renowned not only for its lessons, but also for its atmosphere of constant questioning. For nearly 20 years, Aristotle remained in that environment, listening to Plato's lectures, debating with fellow students, and honing his ideas in a setting that valued speculation about truth, justice, and reality. To most, such access to Plato's thought would have marked the peak of a career. Yet Aristotle did not merely imitate his teacher. Over time, he began to explore areas where aspects of Plato's system appeared incomplete, or where alternative answers might be discovered by taking a different path. Plato taught that the visible world was a lesser copy of perfect forms existing beyond sense perception, pure ideals seen only by the mind. Aristotle questioned why reality should be divided in this way. He asked whether the changing, tangible things around us were not themselves the primary realities. Instead of seeking truth beyond the world, he found meaning within it, in plants and animals, in motion and growth, in things striving towards their purpose. This differing perspective did not develop all at once, and scholars today advise against viewing Aristotle's thought as a simple step-by-step departure from Platonism. However, his focus on lived experience became a defining trait, steering him away from lofty abstractions and towards the structures of the world as we encounter them. Aristotle eventually left the academy and, for a time, lived beyond Athens. His reputation as a thinker grew so much that he was summoned to tutor Alexander, the young prince who would later become Alexander the Great. The scene is easy to picture. A scholar from Stagira guiding the heir to Macedon, sharing ideas about nature, order, and leadership, with a boy who would one day expand his influence into Asia and beyond. In Aristotle's teaching, we see another part of his life, shaping not only theories on paper, but also the mind of someone destined for practical rule. When his role as a tutor ended, Aristotle returned to Athens, now confident to stand as a master in his own right. Here, he founded the Lyceum, his own school. Unlike Plato's Academy, which was known for discussions about ideals, the Lyceum became a place where research and categorization thrived. It housed a substantial collection of writings, preserving copies and accounts of knowledge, and it became a center for inquiry across various subjects. Aristotle himself often walked the long-covered colonnades with his students, turning dialogue into a lively, continuous conversation. These pupils were called the Peripatetics, literally, those who walk about. The rhythm of their steps matched the rhythm of their thoughts, as topics ranged from animal behavior to civic virtue, to the structure of the heavens. The style of teaching was as important as the content. By walking and questioning outdoors, Aristotle embodied a philosophy not confined to lecture halls, but responsive to observation and experience. Students did not merely listen, they collected specimens, took notes, and engaged in research itself. Knowledge was dynamic, developing as one walked. This method aligned with what Aristotle valued most: observation, classification, and the quest for underlying order. What stands out in Aristotle's life is not just the range of subjects he wrote about, but how he insisted these subjects were interconnected. Politics was not separate from biology, nor zoology from ethics. To understand the functions of the body was also to inquire about the nature of the soul. To examine the soul was to consider virtue, and virtue, in turn, was vital to the organization of communities. Instead of isolating fields of study, he arranged them as parts of a continuous, interconnected system. His writings span logic, physics, rhetoric, poetics, zoology, ethics, and political thought, but always with a focus on how each element reinforced the others. This ambition remains astonishing. Consider a single scholar producing treatises on constitutions, detailed studies of animal anatomy, reflections on artistic expression, and analyses of persuasion, while also establishing the very principles of logical reasoning. Aristotle achieved all of this, not merely collecting knowledge, but was determined to organize it. He viewed knowledge as a structure, with each subject serving as a column or arch that supports the whole. In this way, Aristotle was not just a philosopher, he was an architect of knowledge itself. How could one individual attempt such an immense breadth? The answer lies in Aristotle's emphasis on structure. Every inquiry began not only with facts, but with their connection to larger principles. For him, philosophy was about organizing thought. Courage was to be studied not in isolation, but in relation to the soul's habits, and those habits in turn to the needs of a community. Animals were to be studied not merely out of curiosity, but for the roles they played within the living system of nature. The method was both rigorous and integrative, ensuring that knowledge formed a network rather than a collection of isolated fragments. The Lyceum advanced this vision. Inside its walls and across its courtyards, knowledge was organized, classified, and taught as a coherent system. Reports suggest that over the years, his students produced records and studies that supported this effort. Later editors would preserve some of these writings, although the exact form in which his works have come down to us remains a subject of debate. What remains certain is that Aristotle's school was not passive. It operated as a living workshop where thinking itself was shaped and made durable. The legacy extended beyond his lifetime. While Alexander built an empire of territory, Aristotle constructed an empire of ideas. Armies may have faded, but systems of thought endured. His students spread his methods across the Mediterranean, and later cultures reconstructed his texts into the foundations of their own education. By linking intellectual practice with organization and examples from real life, Aristotle provided future generations with a framework that endured long after his scrolls were scattered and restored. So, when you follow the course of his life, from Stagira to Athens, from student to teacher, from tutor to founder, what appears is not just a biography, but a method. Each stage sharpened his focus on connecting observation with reasoning, medicine with philosophy, and ideas with practice. Through the rhythms of his early exposure to science, his questioning at the academy, his teaching of Alexander, and the structured environment of the Lyceum, Aristotle's life was itself a preparation for systemizing human thought. Seeing his life this way helps explain why his work was necessary and why it still matters today. Aristotle did not only record what he observed, he organized knowledge into a framework that provided later thinkers with a set of tools. That framework did not just influence politics, literature, or ethics. It also transformed how reasoning itself could function. With his life laying the foundation, the stage was set for a new development, the first attempt to give human reason an organized blueprint. Aristotle's boldest step was to turn the very act of reasoning into a subject of study. While others concentrated on persuasion or poetic brilliance, he asked, "How can thought be tested for strength, much like a structure is tested for balance?" That question led to what we now call logic, the first systematic framework for valid reasoning. Before his work, Greek debate flourished without such foundations. Arguments relied heavily on sharp style, memorable wording, or sheer presence in the public square. You can imagine groups in the agora exchanging examples or counterexamples, swaying onlookers with clever turns of phrase. The result? Spirited discussion, but often no resolution. A skilled orator could win the day even if the reasoning itself were weak. For those seeking reliable knowledge, this was both exciting and frustrating. Exciting because imagination thrived, frustrating because no standard existed to distinguish what was sound from what was flawed. Aristotle sought more than just performance. He aimed to develop a method that was accessible to everyone, regardless of their personality or social status. Just as music draws patterns from sound and geometry derives rules from shapes, he believed thought itself should have its own set of rules. Reasoning, he argued, could be broken down, organized, and examined step by step. This way, anyone could evaluate the journey from assumption to conclusion. The main tool he introduced was what we call the syllogism. However, it is essential to note that his Greek term, syllogismos, meant deduction more broadly than our modern understanding of the term deduction does. Today, a syllogism typically refers to a strict three-part argument consisting of two premises that lead to a conclusion. For Aristotle, syllogismos covered a wider range of necessary inferences, not just a fixed template. Nonetheless, the familiar form of the syllogism clearly demonstrates his point. If all members of a class share a property and an individual belongs to that class, then that individual necessarily shares the property. Think of it like a small reasoning engine. The premises enter on one side and a conclusion follows on the other, provided the parts connect correctly. If the premises are unsound, or if the pattern does not fit, the engine fails to operate. What logic offered was not truth by default, but a way to verify whether conclusions genuinely followed. This transformed the argument from a clever exchange into something that could be tested. Imagine the syllogism as a pile of bricks with grooves. You cannot stack them any way you like. Some combinations hold, others collapse. The rules ensure that when the bricks align, the result remains stable. Similarly, Aristotle's logic gave arguments an internal structure. Instead of relying on the speaker's persuasiveness, you could follow the pattern and assess validity directly. Yet Aristotle knew that deduction was not the only route. Alongside syllogismos, he also recognized epagoge, induction, which involved reasoning from specific cases to a general conclusion. For example, observing several animals of a type displaying a feature, then inferring that all animals of that type share it. The distinction between deduction, from the general to the specific, and induction, from the particular to the general, highlights how broad his logical thinking was. He wanted a framework capable of explaining both the unfolding of necessity and the growth of insight through observation. The benefits of this new approach were remarkable. First, it ended the endless loops of debate where nothing was resolved. Second, it established a discipline for anyone studying any subject, from ethics to biology. With logic, students gained a method to build, test, and compare reasoning across different fields. Third, it provided a common language. An argument could now be examined solely on its structure, apart from the speaker's charisma. For seekers of knowledge, this was liberating. Of course, imposing rules on thought itself was a bold move. Greek culture valued myth, eloquence, and poetic ambiguity. Did Aristotle risk diminishing the richness of human expression by enforcing strict forms? To some, it might have seemed so. But his goal was not to suppress thought, but to give it a solid foundation. The world might remain complex and unpredictable, yet the methods by which a mind reached its conclusions could be scrutinized. That accountability endured beyond him. Centuries later, patterns of syllogistic reasoning became a cornerstone of education throughout Europe and the wider Mediterranean. Students learned to memorize valid forms, test claims, and even craft sermons or legal arguments using these structures. Although modern logic has far surpassed Aristotle's frameworks, the key insight, that thought can be systematized into patterns governed by rules, still originates here. Consider this: across science, mathematics, debate, and everyday choices, the pattern persists. Scientists suggest hypotheses and draw conclusions based on premises and evidence, following chains of reasoning. Courts and debates evaluate lines of logic rather than surface appeal. Even in private decisions, whether to trust a claim or act on advice, you unknowingly depend on structures rooted in Aristotle's model. Without logic, Aristotle's broader framework could not endure. His studies of nature, politics, or ethics might have remained a mixture of sharp insights and loose associations. With logic, they gained a backbone, a method to test their coherence. He transformed philosophy into something akin to a craft, with rules an apprentice could learn and apply. Just as a builder must respect principles to keep walls upright, a thinker can follow logical forms to keep conclusions steady. Aristotle also maintained that logic was universal. It was not limited to philosophy alone, but extended wherever the mind made claims. Because it concerns form itself, how premises lead to conclusions, it could cross contexts. That universality explains its resilience. Even as circumstances change, the pattern of deduction stays the same. Another notable point is that Aristotle regarded logic not as an artificial invention, but as a clarification of what humans innately do. Minds already reason. His achievement was to make this structure visible. His role resembled that of a map maker. The landscape already exists. but the map helps humans navigate it confidently. By mapping both deduction and induction, he gave reasoning a form that sharpened human abilities. This reframing transformed the argument into a discipline. Where success once belonged to the silver tongue, it now belonged to the clarity of form. That change continues to resonate in how we build knowledge today. When scientists design experiments, when analysts connect data, and when programmers write algorithms, they all rely on principles that trace back to Aristotle's project. His logic remains quietly embedded in daily intellectual life. To understand Aristotle's legacy, you cannot separate biography from method, nor method from structure. His experience at Plato's Academy sharpened his taste for abstract thought. His teaching at the Lyceum gave him the stage, but it was logic that provided the skeleton, the patterned framework without which none of his other systems could have stood. It was the first wall of the structure, often invisible but essential. Ultimately, Aristotle gave more than just words. He established a method for human reason to evaluate itself, to detach from persuasion and verify validity gradually. Every time someone connects ideas into a precise sequence, they continue to follow his system. Once the principles of thought were laid out, a profounder question naturally arose. Beyond our way of thinking, what does it truly mean for anything to exist? If logic addressed reasoning patterns, Aristotle then turned to the patterns of reality itself. This is the field we now refer to as metaphysics. However, a key point for accuracy is that the term metaphysics did not originate with Aristotle. It was added to his works centuries later when Andronicus of Rhodes compiled and arranged his writings. The title simply meant the books after the physics. Therefore, when we speak of Aristotle's metaphysics, we are referring to collected essays, not a single unified treatise. Yet within those essays lies his most ambitious effort, an attempt to delineate the principles of existence itself. At its core, Aristotle's inquiry was not about being as an abstract idea, but about beings qua being. In other words, he asked, what features do entities possess simply because they exist? When you look around at people, animals, tools, plants, or buildings, they all vary. But insofar as they exist, what unites them? This approach gave metaphysics a systematic purpose: to study existence at its most general level, beyond the boundaries of any specific subject, such as physics or politics. Immediately, he faced a problem that puzzled earlier thinkers. How can the world contain both change and permanence? Nature is full of constant transformation. A child becomes an adult. A lump of clay is shaped into a pot. Bad weather clears to sunshine, but behind the flux, patterns stay steady. No child grows into a tree. Clay takes predictable forms. Weather follows seasons. There appears to be order within change. Aristotle aimed to find principles that explain both sides of this paradox without reducing one to the other. His framework involved a set of interconnected terms: substance, matter, form, potentiality, and actuality. Each component helped explain how things could persist while also changing. Substance was, for him, the fundamental core that endures when appearances alter. Unlike Plato's forms, perfect ideals existing outside space and time, Aristotle situated substance within this world. To be a substance is not to be a shadow of some higher perfection, but to be itself: a tree, a horse, a human, a tool, with all its potential to manifest in different states. Substance is structured by two dimensions: matter and form. Matter is the raw material, the fundamental stuff. Form is the organizing principle, the structure that makes matter a specific thing rather than just undifferentiated material. Together, they form substance. Take a bronze statue. The bronze is matter. The sculpted shape is form. Neither alone makes a statue, but combined, they produce a recognizable substance, a real, existing being. This leads us to Aristotle's distinction between potentiality and actuality, a core aspect of his philosophy. Potentiality describes what a thing could become under the right conditions, while actuality is what it is in the present moment. Seeds exemplify this idea clearly. To the eye, a seed appears small and inactive, yet it harbors the potential to grow into a tree. This potential is genuine. It belongs inherently to the seed. With soil, water, and sunlight, that potential transforms into actuality. The seed becomes a living tree. Change, therefore, is a structured process, rather than a random break in identity. In this framework, alteration does not signify chaos. It means the realization of what already exists in potential. Metals possess the potential to be shaped into tools. A block of marble could potentially be carved into many figures, and musicians hold the potential to perform. Actualization is the process of bringing potential into a visible, structured form. For Aristotle, this explains how the world moves and develops without losing coherence. The flux conceals an intelligible order of potential becoming actual. Such an account sharply separated him from his teacher, Plato. Plato argued that actual reality belonged to a transcendent realm of forms, perfect chairs, trees, horses, existing beyond space and time, of which all physical examples are imperfect copies. Aristotle rejected this. He maintained that the explanation resides within the things themselves. A chair is not a faded copy of some otherworldly chairness. It is a union of matter, wood or metal, with form, arranged into a shape that functions as a chair. The form does not exist outside the world. It is realized in the substance you sit on. This way of thinking enabled Aristotle to reconcile the concepts of change and permanence. Matter may change, bronze can lose shape, a living thing can age, but form remains the intelligible structure that science can study. Knowledge, then, becomes possible because it grasps form rather than merely chasing the fleeting appearance of matter. For example, countless trees sprout and decay, but the organizing principle of tree, the structure that defines this living thing, persists. That explains how a science of nature could exist. The scientist studies not the individual tree that perishes, but the form that remains stable across cases. The scope of this framework extends far beyond plants or objects. Human capacities, too, could be viewed through potential and actual. A child has the potential for speech. When speaking, that potential is realized. An artist has the potential to create. By producing a painting, that potential is brought into actuality. Consciousness itself is potential perception, becoming actuality in thought. The principle is applied everywhere, from physics to psychology to ethics. By grounding explanation in this world rather than in a separate realm, Aristotle made a decisive shift in philosophy. His metaphysics reassured thinkers that studying reality as it appears can lead to genuine truth. The world holds its own understandable order. Scientists and philosophers can explore without needing to refer to another dimension of forms. That is why Aristotle's metaphysical approach proved so fundamental. It made this worldly inquiry philosophically valid. Now, historically, we should add a caveat. The text we refer to as the Metaphysics is not necessarily a unified masterwork. Scholars generally believe it is a collection of essays and lectures that Andronicus later assembled. There is no hidden, seamless structure throughout the whole. Instead, we have a compilation of Aristotle's investigations into beings qua being. Yet, even as separate pieces, they promote a coherent philosophical vision. They wrestle with substance, causation, potentiality, and actuality in a manner that provides later generations with a framework to extend or challenge. Critics over centuries have pointed out that Aristotle's system can sometimes seem static, locking substances into fixed forms. Does it allow enough space for novelty or unexpected change? His supporters reply that potentiality itself ensures ongoing movement. Every being contains unrealized possibilities. Change is embedded in the very fabric of existence. In this way, his model balances permanence with change more effectively than competing theories. For you today, the significance of these ideas should be clear. Engineers differentiate between material and design, echoing the distinction between matter and form. Biologists classify species based on structural traits, a modern approach to identifying enduring principles underlying variation. Everyday language reflects the same distinction. We consider what something is made of and how it is arranged. The matter-form division still shapes how you describe the world. And whenever you imagine possibilities, who you might become, what a tool might accomplish, what a project could develop into, you are invoking potentiality waiting to become actuality. Aristotle referred to this inquiry as the first philosophy because it seeks the most fundamental principles underpinning all other knowledge. If logic determines how thoughts should be organized, metaphysics explores how reality itself can be understood as ordered. Together, they establish a more solid foundation for knowledge. Thought operates according to rules, and so does being. This twin reassurance underpins every aspect of his system. Later, theologians drew on these ideas for debates about creation and divine purpose. Natural philosophers expanded them to stars and planets. Modern science often employs different terms: energy states, transformations, structures. Yet the pattern resembles Aristotle's map of actuality, unfolding from potential. Although concepts evolve, the question he raised remains: how can things change while maintaining their identity? That illustrates the extent of his metaphysical ambition. By examining beings as such and outlining concepts such as substance, matter, form, potentiality, and actuality, he provided us with a structured view of existence. His framework shifted philosophy from a quest for otherworldly ideals to a study rooted in this world. Even today, the questions he posed influence how we think about science, nature, and human life. Yet, he did not stop at describing existence. If the world's structure is real and understandable, it presents an immediate challenge. How should humans study it systematically? Inquiry cannot remain ad hoc. It requires a method that respects both logic and metaphysics. This challenge marked his next step: the endeavor to devise rules for investigating nature with precision. Aristotle believed that understanding reality required more than deep reflection. It also needed a framework for study. What emerged was his blueprint for science. At a time when there were no microscopes, telescopes, or instruments for controlled experiments, he still sought a method that would make inquiry systematic. Knowledge, he argued, should not remain as scattered accounts or isolated traditions. If reality held order, then investigation, too, had to be structured. His answer was to provide the earliest design for what could one day become the sciences. The beginning of this framework was marked by one guiding demand: knowledge must combine careful observation with sound organization. People before him had long noticed patterns. Sailors knew the stars, farmers observed the seasons, and hunters recognized traits of animals. However, all these insights remained fragmented, passed on as skills or instincts. Aristotle transformed them by insisting that observations only gained meaning once they were categorized into networks, where each fact supported and related to others. Knowledge needed shape, and shape demanded method. The difficulty was apparent. How could anyone establish reliable science without experiments or advanced tools? Aristotle lacked the instruments that later natural philosophers would come to depend on. His resources were limited to his senses, reasoning, and the testimony of others. Yet, instead of seeing this as a barrier, Aristotle viewed it as a challenge of method. He maintained that truth could still be approached by gathering information carefully, comparing observations, and organizing them within sound explanatory frameworks. For him, even without microscopes or equations, order could emerge if inquiry followed disciplined rules. At the heart of that discipline was a firm belief: knowledge was cumulative. Each observation contributed a small piece, but when correctly combined with others, the pieces formed patterns more dependable than any single account. He desired theories to develop from repeated attention, not sudden leaps of speculation. When the same patterns appeared consistently, they could be trusted. Science, in his view, was constructed by layering such observations into a connected whole. One of the clearest examples of this approach appears in his zoological work. Aristotle and his students carefully documented the characteristics of animals, including their limbs, breathing, reproduction, and movement. From these observations, he grouped them into categories. He distinguished animals with internal skeletons from those without, echoing today's division of vertebrates and invertebrates. It was not naming for curiosity's sake. It was an architect's effort to arrange the living world into a structure that reflected natural order as clearly as possible, using the tools available. This seemingly simple step marked a significant shift. It allowed science to progress through method rather than inspiration alone. Observe first, gather consistent data, classify based on shared traits, then interpret and explain. Such a model enabled knowledge to be shared, expanded, and corrected over generations. Systems became more critical than individual brilliance. With a structured method, anyone could contribute to the expanding edifice of study. Here, his logical foundation reappears compellingly. From his posterior analytics, Aristotle outlined a process he called apodeixis, or demonstration. This was reasoning based on deduction, where conclusions followed from premises that were primary, immediate, and better known than the conclusion itself. When such demonstrations succeeded, they produced not only knowledge of the fact, but also comprehension of the cause, understanding why something must be as it is and could not be otherwise. This focus reveals how closely he connected science with explanation. Observation provided the data, but demonstration assured that understanding went beyond mere description to necessity. However, there is an important nuance. Despite his ideal of demonstration, much of Aristotle's surviving scientific writing does not display fully developed syllogisms in the strict schematic form he later outlined. You could examine his zoological works and find detailed classifications and causal discussions, but very few examples that resemble textbook syllogistic deductions. Scholars note this gap between his ideal and actual practice. Aristotle laid down the rules for what science should achieve. but in his extant texts, he often employed looser applications. This serves as a reminder of both the ambition of his project and the practical constraints imposed by the materials and methods available to him. Part of his emphasis on thorough explanation also appears in his account of causes. To understand a thing, Aristotle argued, you must be able to answer 4 questions. What is its material cause, the substance it is made of? What is its formal cause, the structure or definition that makes it the kind of thing it is? What is its efficient cause, the source of its movement or change? And what is its final cause, the end or purpose for which it exists? In today's language, these are called the material, formal, efficient, and final causes. Together, they form a framework for fully explaining both natural objects and human artifacts. For example, a statue can be explained through all 4 causes. Its material cause is the marble. Its formal cause is the shape that defines it as a representation of a figure. Its efficient cause is the sculptor chiseling away. Its final cause may be the commemoration of a person or a decoration for a temple. By applying this analysis across nature, Aristotle gained an understanding of more than a collection of facts. It became a quest for layered reasons, not just what is present, but why, how, and for what purpose. Although later science has essentially removed the concept of final cause from natural explanations, the habit of seeking multiple layers of understanding has remained influential. Modern scientists often ask not just what is there, but also how it functions, how it came into being, and what laws govern its existence. Aristotle's framework encouraged investigators to aim for completeness rather than partial glimpses. His consistency gave this approach unusual stability compared to earlier ideas. Other philosophers had claimed that all matter came from water, fire, or indivisible atoms. Such single principles were bold, but offered limited methods for further study. Aristotle opposed those reductions. Instead, he sought categories that could accommodate many observations while remaining open to refinement. By insisting on structured organization, he laid the foundations of science that could later support discoveries. Of course, many of his own claims did not stand the test of time. He believed in spontaneous generation, that life could arise from decaying matter. He misinterpreted some animal functions without the aid of instruments. But the remarkable feature was not the survival of every explanation, but the resilience of a method robust enough to correct errors over time. His framework ensured that mistakes could be tested, disproved, and replaced, while the overall structure of inquiry remained intact. This is why many historians regard him as the first great methodologist. He emphasized that observation was necessary, that classification brought clarity, and that explanations required causes. Collectively, these principles formed a practice far beyond mere speculation or rhetorical flair. They paved the way for disciplines that would develop over millennia. And the influence remains evident today. Modern scientific research relies on systematic observation, careful data collection, classification, and explanation. Journals require transparent methods, laboratories follow structured protocols, and evidence takes precedence over personality. This culture of disciplined inquiry originates from Aristotle's approach. Although instruments and theories have evolved almost beyond recognition, the core rhythm remains aligned with his framework. Subsequent ages built upon that foundation. Medieval scholars integrated his methods into scholastic systems. Naturalists expanded catalogs of plants and animals. Astronomers mapped the skies with increasing precision. Each new tool, lenses, barometers, microscopes, fitted within a structure that Aristotle helped to outline. The sciences developed into separate fields, yet all carried the sense that ordered investigation, rather than scattered insight, was the rightful path to knowledge. The challenge he accepted, to create rules without experiments, revealed both his genius and his limitations. He lacked the trials and measurements you might expect from modern science, yet he outlined the framework on which those would depend. He turned study into a shared discipline rather than an individual show of brilliance. Ideas could be tested, revised, and passed on to others. That cultural shift mattered as much as any particular claim. This is why Aristotle's work still resonates. His details may be outdated, but his demand for structure transformed science inquiry. In your world, experiments and data analysis stand far beyond anything he knew. Yet the steps, observe, classify, explain, are recognizably his. That continuity ensures his place in history, not only as a philosopher, but as an architect of method. If logic gave thought its rules, and metaphysics gave being its principles, then his blueprint for science provided the process for study. That process turned attention outward, enabling close and systematic records of the living world. And it is in those records that we see Aristotle's method at work most vividly, in his effort to describe, compare, and categorize the creatures he encountered. Aristotle applied his structured method to one of the most challenging subjects, the natural world. He undertook the task of observing, recording, and classifying living things with an unprecedented level of care and attention. Working without lenses, microscopes, or laboratories, he depended on sight, dissection, comparison, and his own reasoning. To him, the world of animals and plants was not mere background to human affairs, but the most immediate evidence of reality itself. Whether it was insects buzzing across a field, dolphins surfacing in the sea, or people moving through the marketplace, everything became an object of study. His curiosity drove him to understand the diversity of life with the same determination he applied to logic and metaphysics. The scope of his observations was extensive. He wrote about fish, birds, mammals, and invertebrates. He cataloged countless descriptions of their form, movement, and habits. Bees in particular fascinated him because of the apparent organization within their hives, with different members performing distinct roles in what seemed to be a community. Dolphins also drew his attention. Contrary to common belief at the time, he noted that they did not merely draw sustenance from water, but must surface for air, an early recognition that they were not fish, but breathed in a manner closer to land animals. Octopuses also featured prominently in his records. He described not only their general anatomy, but also how they used their 8 limbs with remarkable dexterity. Most notably, Aristotle observed that one of the tentacles in males appeared to play a special role in reproduction, a detail later biologists would term hectocotylization. This observation, previously ignored for centuries, was only re-examined when modern science revisited it. So how accurate could these accounts be without modern equipment? Surprisingly often, Aristotle's claims align closely with later confirmation. His grouping of animals into those with blood and those without resembles the vertebrate and invertebrate division still used today. His remarks about species that give birth to live young versus those that lay eggs helped connect reproduction to classification. He carefully described life cycles over time, rather than leaving them to myth, and many of his observations still read as sound and methodical descriptions. Of course, accuracy was inconsistent. Bees puzzled him, and although he provided detailed records of their behavior, his account of reproduction was inaccurate. He mistakenly believed that in insects, the female inserted a part into the male, reversing the true nature of copulation. For some species, he left reproduction uncertain. Where he lacked instruments, he occasionally relied on unverified claims, such as spontaneous generation, the idea that flies or worms could arise from decaying flesh or mud on their own. In some sections, reports from distant regions blurred the lines between real animals and legendary ones. It was not a failure of attention, but rather the natural limit of investigation without microscopes, controlled breeding pens, and knowledge of microbes. To us, these inaccuracies are obvious and easily overlooked, but for Aristotle in his time, the achievement was significant. His successes demonstrate the strength of perseverance and reasoning, while his missteps reveal the unavoidable gaps that occur when investigation relies solely on unaided senses and second-hand reports. To accomplish what he did with so little is a testament to how far systematic curiosity can extend, even under limitations. The balance of insight and limitation also points to a greater truth. Science is not a flawless record, but an ongoing process. Each step builds on what came before, correcting, refining, and removing what is unnecessary. Aristotle's contribution was not that he alone achieved final accuracy, but that he fostered a habit of deliberate description and categorization. He shifted inquiry away from myths and singular stories towards a discipline of observation, grouping, and questioning. That shift made correction and improvement possible because later readers could evaluate his notes, keep what aligned with their own observations, and amend what did not. This represented a change in how knowledge was recorded. Before Aristotle, most accounts of animals and plants appeared as fragments, travelers' tales, poetic lines, or isolated curiosities. In Aristotle, we see the first attempt to create a sustained catalog. You can imagine him gathering material, not just from his own observations, but from conversations with fishermen about creatures they drew from the sea, with shepherds about their flocks, or with farmers about their fields. He listened, compiled, and wrote. The result was one of the earliest encyclopedias of the living world. Even when imperfect, the organized ambition itself made history. What further set him apart was that he did not stop at description just for its own sake. Curious anecdotes alone would not have satisfied him. For each animal, he inquired why it was the way it was, why one species breathed with lungs and another with gills, why some laid eggs while others nurtured their young internally, why organs appeared specially suited to specific functions. Behind the details, he searched for cause, behind each trait, for explanation. A dolphin surfacing for air was not merely a fact, but evidence of a larger order within the structure of living beings. In this manner, his biology linked back to his metaphysics. The ideas of potential and actuality, abstract in theory, became visible in the growth of an egg to maturity or a seed into a tree. Nature itself exemplified his philosophy, potentials transforming into actual states, form sculpting matter into recognizable beings. His notebooks served as bridges between thought and reality, a union of philosophical ideas and direct observation. From today's perspective, not all of his interpretations are valid. His appeal to purpose in explaining features has been replaced in biology by the language of adaptation and variation shaped by genetics and natural selection. The final causes of organs are less convincing to modern scientists. However, the very act of asking about purpose gave natural history its questions. Without that step, biology might have remained a collection of lists rather than a search for patterns and explanations. His method, observe first, compare carefully, then explain, remains the foundation of honest science. Errors, therefore, should not overshadow his achievement. In fact, they confirm it. They show what it meant to attempt early science without magnification or experiments. Some mistakes stemmed from tradition, while others arose from speculation that filled gaps. However, his effort to develop explanations marked a decisive break from accepting myths unchallenged. He made mistakes that could be tested and shown to be false, which is more productive than untestable stories that remain unchanged. The connection to our own practices might surprise you. Modern biology, with its use of microscopes, genetic analysis, and global surveys, seems far removed from his uncomplicated dissections and records. Yet at its core, the scientist in the field still writes notes, sketches, and asks straightforward questions about behavior and form. Even large-scale projects start with the same approach. Observe closely, classify carefully, and build explanations gradually. Aristotle's work can be seen not only as a chapter from history, but as the first strong echo of a habit we have never abandoned. The notebooks of his Lyceum thus hold a special place in history. They were not sacred texts or mythical stories, but organized efforts to record living diversity. Later, thinkers could challenge, refine, and improve them because his framework allowed it. And that is what science became, the slow development of better descriptions and explanations. Much of that culture, the practice of inquiry as a connected pursuit, not a collection of isolated tales, begins with Aristotle. His research into animals and plants reveals both the limits of his era and the lasting importance of a systematic approach. He could describe octopuses in extraordinary detail, insightfully observe the surfacing of dolphins, and equally confidently document mistaken ideas about insects. This combination tells us less about failure than about the state of knowledge itself, science finding its footing between myth and instrument. His actual achievement lay not just in the information he recorded, but in the structure he provided. Observe, compare, classify, and seek explanation. That framework is why later biology was able to develop. And from here, Aristotle's focus shifted. Having studied life beyond himself, he turned inward to ask what defines living beings from within. If animals and plants exhibit physical structures and behaviors, what about humans and the mysterious faculties of thought, sensation, and feeling? To explore these, Aristotle began to study the soul itself, the organizing principle of life, and the first foundations of what we now call psychology. How did Aristotle begin to explain what it means to think, feel, and perceive centuries before the discipline of psychology even existed? He believed that the puzzles of inner life could not be left to poetry or myth. Just as he had provided frameworks for reasoning, for being, and for science, he sought one for the mind. His treatise, De Anima, on the soul, became the first organized attempt to describe mental life systematically. Today, we call this psychology. For Aristotle, it remained part of philosophy, integrated within his broader aim of ordering all branches of knowledge. The challenge was more elusive than anything he had attempted before. Minds are not like objects or organs you can examine directly. You cannot lay out thoughts on a table. You cannot point at imagination the way you might point at a leaf or a stone. But Aristotle refused to see this as a barrier. He regarded the soul not as a ghostly substance, but as the principle that makes living beings what they are. Here, he linked psychology directly to his metaphysics of form and matter. Just as matter becomes a real substance only when given form, so a body becomes a living being only because it has a soul, the form of the body. He illustrated this with images. An axe without its sharpness is just wood and metal, not an axe. An eye without sight is not an eye in the proper sense. In the same way, a body without the capacities of the soul is not truly alive. This marked a significant departure from traditional practices. Poets imagined souls drifting to the underworld. Some thinkers set the mind apart as divine and untouchable. Aristotle rejected both. He argued that body and soul are inseparable. The soul is not something hovering above the body, but the organizing pattern of its functions. A hand without a body cannot grasp, and likewise, a soul apart from a body cannot sense or think. In this view, to study the soul is not to abandon the material world, but to examine the body's powers at their most fundamental. Perception, memory, imagination, even desire, these are not intrusions from beyond, but natural capacities that reveal what it means to live. To clarify this idea, he established a hierarchy. He argued that all living beings possess a soul, but not in the same way. Plants, which grow and reproduce, have the nutritive soul. This is the fundamental life function, to consume nourishment and to reproduce. Animals possess a sensory soul, which includes nutritive powers, but also enables them to perceive and move in response. Humans, at the highest level, have the rational soul. This includes all the lower functions, along with the capacity to reason, speak, and imagine futures not yet realized. According to his view, souls are layered, an ascending hierarchy of powers that explains continuity across species, as well as the distinct differences between them. What stands out is the methodical arrangement. Life is not just one flat category, but a spectrum of abilities, organized and ranked. Plants show the starting point, animals extend it, human beings reach its peak. By presenting the soul in this layered manner, Aristotle provided the first recognizably psychological model, an inner life mapped with the same discipline he used for studying animals or laws. His investigation of perception reveals how innovative his approach was. To sense something, he argued, is not to absorb its material. You do not take in the tree itself when you see it. Instead, you grasp its form. He likened perception to pressing a seal into wax. The wax receives the impression of the seal, but not the metal. Likewise, the mind gets the form of the object without its substance. This explanation helped to naturalize perception. Hearing a sound was not something mystical. It was the form of the vibration received, leaving the matter behind. Smelling was not the object traveling into you, but its structure, leaving an impression. That framework laid the foundations for questions that persist to this day. How do our minds represent objects that are not physically present? What does it mean for thought to carry an image once the stimulus has vanished? For Aristotle, the answer was that forms, once impressed, could linger. From this arose memory, which involves the retention of impressions over time, and imagination, the power to rearrange those impressions in new ways. Reason then develops from memory and imagination, incorporating language and abstraction. Of course, not every detail has withstood modern scrutiny. He believed that the heart, not the brain, was the center of sensation and thought. That view has long been overturned. However, the structure connecting sensations, memory, imagination, and reason still feels familiar. What mattered most was his refusal to treat the soul as supernatural. Instead, he saw it as a natural set of capacities. Aristotle also added nuance often overlooked. He did not claim that every event of the soul was entirely physical. Instead, he distinguished between events that are actualizations of a living capacity, like vision or thought, and changes in the stricter physical sense, such as heating or cooling. This made his idea neither mystical nor reductively physicalist by today's standards. It suggested that psychological activity can be natural without being reduced solely to material change. Integrating psychology into this model made it a part of the biological model. Studying the soul meant exploring what living bodies can do when functioning correctly. This was significant. He effectively transformed psychology into a branch of the natural sciences long before either field took its modern form. This integration prevented fragmentation. The mind could be studied alongside the body as part of the same organized system. The radical nature of this becomes clear when compared to rival views of his time. Some argued that thought belonged to the heavens and was beyond human reach. Others dismissed the inner life as myth. Aristotle took the opposite stance. By grounding it on earth, he elevated its importance. The soul was natural and lawful. That meant it could be analyzed, compared, and categorized. Thought became a subject of study, not myth. His detailed attention supports this. He wondered whether dreaming was part of sensory function or something separate. He separated desire from reason to explore how action follows one rather than the other. He distinguished memory from perception, asking what allows an image to persist once sensation has ceased. Even his reflections on imagination anticipated later debates. How can the mind combine impressions to picture things that never existed? Each of these questions points to processes that modern psychology continues to investigate. By laying these out, Aristotle created one of the first structured accounts of mental life. He gave psychology categories, analogies, and clear distinctions. It stopped being an area of poetic metaphor and became an organized inquiry. This was his achievement. He incorporated the inner world into his broader structure of knowledge. The implications extend far beyond his lifetime. Modern neuroscience, cognitive science, and philosophy of mind all treat thought, sensation, and perception as functions of living organisms. That assumption, that the mental belongs to the natural, is Aristotelian at its core. When you think of yourself as a being who perceives, remembers, and imagines by natural powers within your body, you echo his claim. This is why it's important to you today. The idea that thought is not beyond study but can be mapped and analyzed originates from Aristotle's insistence that the soul is both natural and structured. Psychology may be young in its current form. Still, its foundation was laid over 2,000 years ago in Athens, in a work that argued that inner life belonged to systematic philosophy. Could you reflect on what this means for the course of his project? He provided rules for thinking, mapped what it means to exist, and developed a method for studying nature. With psychology, he integrated the unseen powers of life into that system. Both the external and internal worlds could be ordered. But this raised another question. If human beings possess the power of reason as part of their soul, how should that influence the way they live? What should they do with the rational capacities that distinguish them? It is here that Aristotle's inquiry shifts towards the question of the good life and the search for what it means not just to live, but to live well. How should a person live if they want their life to be not just long, but good? This was the central question of Aristotle's ethics. For him, survival alone was never enough. To avoid pain or obey laws was not the same as living fully. What mattered was a state he called eudaimonia. Often translated as happiness, it more closely means flourishing, the fulfillment of human potential through reason, virtue, and activity. A good life was about becoming what you are most capable of being, not simply chasing comfort or avoiding hardship. Aristotle's main account of this appears in his Nicomachean Ethics. He did not write it as a rule book with commandments to follow, nor did he present morality as a promise of rewards in another world. Instead, he created something practical. Ethics, for him, was more like training a craft. It was something you developed through practice and refinement, similar to learning to play an instrument or shaping clay on a wheel. What mattered was not mechanical obedience, but the growth of character. Virtue and good judgment matured through repetition until they became second nature. At the core of this idea were the virtues. A virtue was a stable trait of character, a way of being that prepared you to act rightly. But he made them distinctive by describing them as balances. Virtue was always a mean between excess and deficiency. Courage offered the clearest example. On one side was cowardice, shrinking away from all risk. On the other side was rashness, rushing into danger without a thought. Courage was in between, recognizing fear but not being paralyzed by it, facing danger with measured judgment. By directly naming cowardice and rashness, he clarified the ethical balance. This pattern applied everywhere. Generosity was midway between wastefulness and miserliness. Temperance sat between indulgence and insensibility. Truthfulness found its mean between self-deprecation and boastfulness. Justice, patience, friendliness, each had extremes to avoid and a middle ground to foster harmony. According to his view, virtue was less about strict rules and more about steering a course between vices pulling from either side. The mean, however, was not always an exact midpoint. Aristotle emphasized something more subtle. In many cases, one extreme is much more common than the other. This means the virtuous balance might be closer to one side. For temperance, he noted, too little taste for pleasure is rare, while overindulgence is widespread. Therefore, the virtuous state of temperance often focuses more on resisting excess than on correcting scarcity. This complexity demonstrates Aristotle's careful observation of life's nuances. He saw ethics not as a simple mathematical balance, but as a living judgment sensitive to human tendencies and emotions. One way to understand his idea is by returning to his analogy of music. Think of a string being tuned on a lyre. Pull it too tight and the sound shrieks. Leave it slack and the sound collapses. Actual music arises when it is set at just the correct tension, but the adjustment is not always exactly halfway. Depending on the instrument and the string, the correct pitch may be closer to one side of the string. You adjust until the note resonates clearly. Aristotle argued that human character works similarly. Virtue is not an abstract line, but the living sound of balanced habits. Habits were central in this system. No child is born generous, temperate, or courageous. These traits are not innate, but developed through practice. You acquire them by doing them. A person becomes courageous by practicing calm responses to fear, initially in small matters and then in larger ones. A person becomes just by acting reasonably, not once, but repeatedly, until fairness becomes their natural response. The process of forming habits shapes character just as physical exercise strengthens the body. Ethically, what you rehearse becomes who you are. However, habit alone was not sufficient. Without guidance, you might develop customs, but miss the true meaning. This is where Aristotle placed practical wisdom, or phronesis, at the center. If virtues define the right goals, to be just, temperate, or kind, then practical wisdom provides the means. It is the intellectual ability to see in a particular situation, what specific actions would achieve the virtuous end. It transforms general moral knowledge into timely, reliable decisions. For example, knowing that generosity is beneficial is not enough. You must also understand how much, when, and to whom to give. Practical wisdom enables the ethical individual to translate principles into action. It is the guiding hand that applies habits wisely. That made ethics a blend of training and intelligence. Habit provided stability. Reflection guided where habits should be directed. A person could only become virtuous if they cultivated both. Without habit, reason remained abstract. Without reason, habit degenerated into blind tradition. Together, they produced a character tuned to both principle and circumstance. This highlights the sharp difference between Aristotle's ethics and rule-driven systems. He offered no "thou shalt not" tablet. He wanted people to develop into the kinds of beings who naturally acted well. A dishonest person may follow a rule and refrain from lying when threatened with a penalty, but the desire to lie still burns. By contrast, the virtuous person, shaped by habit and wisdom, does not even crave the harmful act. Desire itself has been transformed. Ethics was not about outward conformity, but rather inward transformation. Flourishing, in this view, also required a long-term perspective. Momentary pleasure was too shallow to matter, nor could you call a life happy if it began well but fell into ruin. To flourish meant a life that, seen as a whole, exhibited reason and virtue through changing seasons. This explains why Aristotle linked ethics to social life. No person can flourish in isolation from others. Friendship, family, and civic engagement were essential. Just as a musician needs an orchestra, a person needs a community where virtue can thrive. Practical examples have clarified this. Imagine a soldier. Fleeing in panic marks you as a coward. Charging ahead alone shows rashness, but standing firm with awareness of risk demonstrates courage. Or consider dining. Gorging without restraint is gluttony. Refusing food unnecessarily is denial. Eating moderately with enjoyment exemplifies temperance. These are not outdated examples. They reveal a logic that is still recognized today, that good action demands balance, context, and moderation. Because the correct mean varies with circumstances, Aristotle's ethics remain relevant and adaptable. What is generous for one person may strain another's resources. What is considered courageous in one situation may be perceived as rash in another. The balance cannot be distilled into a simple rule. Virtue requires mature judgment, not mechanical rule following. This adaptability is why his ethics continue to be studied. It cultivates discernment more than obedience. That might sound demanding, but it also made virtue accessible. Aristotle asserted that courage, temperance, and justice were not distant ideals, but practices anyone could develop through effort. Every day offered small opportunities to nurture these qualities, to practice moderation in action. Consistent effort gradually shaped you into someone for whom virtue felt natural. Ethics, then, was not an ideal state, but a discipline you practiced gradually, step by step. Nevertheless, Aristotle acknowledged that virtue alone was not sufficient. External circumstances were also important. No one living in crushing poverty, isolated from friends, or devastated by disaster could truly claim a flourishing life, no matter how virtuous they were. Good health, companionship, and enough resources were vital supports. Virtue guided how you used these, but luck often set the stage. Ethics was down to earth, not utopian. It recognized both human effort and human limitations. This realism may explain why his ethics remain compelling. It asks not for perfection imposed from outside, but for growth cultivated from within. You see it in the way modern thought views morality as character and empathy, not merely prohibition. You see it in how people value self-improvement instead of fear of punishment. Aristotle gave language and structure to that intuition thousands of years ago. So what is the result? Instead of binding you to strict commandments, his ethics offers a way of seeing life as a project of self-shaping. It raises practical questions, not just what should I do, but what kind of person should I become? And in answering, it provides tools, habits trained, judgment sharpened, decisions guided by practical wisdom. Yet Aristotle understood that humans are not only individuals. Virtue matters for people both in groups and alone. If one person needs structure to mature, what about entire communities made up of many different lives? That question led him from ethics into his related work, politics, where he would ask how human beings best organize themselves together. If individual virtue required structure, Aristotle believed the same principle applied to society as a whole. He saw politics not merely as a contest for power, but as the organization of communal life aimed at a shared purpose. A human being was not sufficient in isolation. The city, or polis, was the natural culmination of human association, the place where laws, education, and public life could shape conditions for the good life. He described this development step by step. The most basic bond was the family, uniting man, woman, and child. From families arose the household, called oikia, the unit where daily needs were managed. Several households came together to create the village, or come, and further still, villages joined into the polis, the city-state. Each stage grew naturally out of the one before, but the polis was not just a larger version of a household or village. Instead, it was the completed form of association, where human beings could exercise reason, justice, and deliberate about shared aims. A solitary life might meet some needs, but only within a polis could people live fully as political animals. This picture highlighted an immediate problem. How do you design a society so that both individual freedom and collective stability last? If people only pursued personal interests, the polis would come apart. If the state enforced control without considering individuals, life would descend into domination. Aristotle recognized this tension between autonomy and community as the main challenge of politics. A healthy city had to support both, defending citizens as individuals and uniting them towards common goods. Unlike his teacher Plato, who outlined an imagined republic, Aristotle preferred to study actual city-states. He collected examples of existing constitutions and laws, comparing which succeeded or failed. This practical approach led to a typology that remains influential, his classification of governments into their correct forms and the corrupt versions they could become. He identified three primary correct forms. First, monarchy, where one ruler governs for the good of all. Second, aristocracy, rule by a group of the best citizens, ideally chosen for their virtue and wisdom. Third, polity, politeia, a mixed or constitutional system where many share in governance, often balancing the interests of the rich and the poor. These three forms could each serve the community because they aimed for the common good. But alongside each, a distorted form existed. Monarchy easily descended into tyranny, where power was wielded for personal gain. Aristocracy could decay into oligarchy, where wealth alone dictated rule, and leaders acted in the interest of their own class. Similarly, polity could collapse into a misinterpreted democracy, rule by numbers alone, where mob pressure overshadowed justice and reasoned deliberation. This pairing of noble and corrupt forms demonstrated his belief that no constitution was inherently stable. The motives and purpose of rulers mattered more than the system's name. This framework still echoes today in concerns: fears of tyranny, complaints about oligarchs, worries about mob rule replacing reason. Aristotle's categories provided later thinkers with both vocabulary and structure for understanding power. More than fixed types, they revealed the possibilities into which any government might drift. Yet, for Aristotle, politics was not solely about classification. He asked a deeper question: what is the ultimate aim of politics? The answer pointed back to eudaimonia, the good life. Protecting the city, defending against foes, and amassing wealth were not goals in themselves. Instead, they were means to an end. The true purpose of politics was to establish conditions in which citizens could flourish, living in accordance with reason, virtue, and shared purpose. If individuals remained corrupt, no constitution could genuinely help. But a virtuous people could manage even an imperfect constitution with justice. This placed politics and ethics side by side. The virtues cultivated by individuals were not isolated qualities. They affected social life. Education, public ritual, and law were means by which good character was extended into communal order. A city succeeded to the extent that it created conditions supportive of virtue. Power alone was never the measure. The accurate measure was the kind of life its citizens could realistically live. One analogy captures this idea. Think of society as an orchestra. Each player matters. A violin on its own produces music, but it is limited. A trumpet has strength, but without harmony, it overpowers. Only when instruments join under shared rhythm and direction does music emerge. Similarly, in a polis, citizens must act together, guided by leadership that aims not at selfish display, but at balance. The resulting composition was not just sound, but a life well lived. Yet, Aristotle's vision also reflected the blind spots of his era. His politics accepts forms of inequality we now condemn. He justified slavery as a natural institution and limited citizenship to a select group, excluding women, foreigners, and laborers. These boundaries highlight both the brilliance of his framework and the limitations of his perspective. What endures, however, is his principle that politics should be assessed based on whether it allows its citizens, however narrowly defined, to flourish. It remains a standard by which modern societies evaluate themselves, even as definitions of citizenship have expanded far beyond Aristotle's scope. His warnings about wealth inequality are particularly enduring. A city divided between a small elite and a large, impoverished population was at risk of collapse. Both instability and resentment followed extremes. He stressed the importance of a middle group, citizens neither destitute nor excessively wealthy, capable of balanced judgment and civic engagement. A robust middle class underpinned political health, stabilizing government against the influence of the powerful few and the raw masses. That concept, the value of the middle class, has persisted as one of his most enduring political insights. He also viewed governments not as static entities, but as living things subject to change. Monarchies could descend into tyranny, while polities might rise into stability, and each shift depended on the choices of both rulers and the ruled. This realistic perspective set him apart from more speculative theories. For Aristotle, simply naming a constitution was not enough. Its health relied on continuous behavior. Politics was alive and evolving, much like the citizens themselves. Ultimately, his conclusion was clear. Politics was not merely about establishing authority or defending territory. It was also about shaping public opinion. At its heart, it was the systematic organization of human association intended to promote the good life. Constitutions succeeded when they achieved this aim and failed when they overlooked it. Just as with logic, metaphysics, or science, Aristotle emphasized a structure that linked observation with underlying principles. For you, the outcome is simple to follow. Modern debates on liberty and order, the balance between the wealthy and the poor, corruption, and the common good all trace back to ideas he established long ago. His classification of governments, his cautions about imbalance, and his assertion that politics exists for human flourishing remain vital. However, Aristotle acknowledged that politics did not keep society united solely through laws. The language citizens used to speak, persuade, and imagine collectively was equally important. Speech could either bring people together or divide them, educate or deceive, inspire virtue or provoke chaos. Beyond speech, art and drama cultivated emotion and shared identity. After outlining the structures of governance, Aristotle focused on these forces, demonstrating how communication and stories influence community life. How can words influence minds and stories shape societies? For Aristotle, this question extended beyond poetry alone, encompassing political slogans designed to evoke emotion. He believed that persuasion, the act of convincing others through speech, could be studied as a systematic discipline, with rules and structures similar to those of logic or science. In his Rhetoric and Poetics, he developed frameworks illustrating how language and art function, and his insights continue to resonate whenever people attempt to persuade or craft stories to impact an audience. Aristotle understood that this task was delicate. Persuasion is powerful, but it also carries the risk of distortion. A well-constructed argument can convey truth, yet the same tools can also conceal it. The challenge was clear: how to study rhetoric without reducing it to mere manipulation. Traveling sophists of his time had treated rhetoric like a game, nothing more than the art of winning debates regardless of truth. Aristotle rejected this approach. He made rhetoric the counterpart of logic. Logic provided the rules for correct reasoning. Rhetoric offered the method for expressing that reasoning to others. Without it, sound ideas might remain unspoken. With it, people could establish laws, policies, and a common understanding. To clarify the concept of persuasion, he divided it into three parts: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos refers to the speaker's character and credibility, whether the audience considers the speaker trustworthy and morally reliable. Pathos signifies emotion, the way speech evokes feelings of fear, joy, hope, or anger to encourage action. Logos means logic or reasoning, the clear argument, evidence, and structure supporting the claim. Aristotle insisted that true rhetoric combines all three. A strong appeal requires credibility, emotional resonance, and precise reasoning. Take a practical example. Imagine persuading a friend to make a healthier choice. Ethos might involve mentioning your own balanced lifestyle and knowledge to earn their trust. Pathos would mean inspiring them to feel how much better they will feel afterwards, their energy, or the relief of avoiding illness. Logos would involve citing evidence, such as studies showing consistent benefits of such a change. Each method is effective on its own, but together they create a greater impact. Aristotle's contribution was to demonstrate that persuasion works best when ethos, pathos, and logos are balanced. This framework transformed rhetoric into something teachable and structured rather than a mysterious talent. It helped students of the Lyceum learn to speak in ways that are both clear and responsible. It also introduced a measure to judge whether persuasion is sound or corrupt. A speech that relies solely on emotion risks deception. One that is logical but lacks credibility may be dismissed as such. The balance is essential. Rhetoric, for Aristotle, carried moral significance. It was intended to serve truth, not obscure it. Yet Aristotle's focus did not end with speech. In his Poetics, he turned to the study of poetry and drama. However, it is essential to note a distinction in his use of terms here. For him, art or techne meant a general craft, such as navigation or medicine, where skill produces beneficial outcomes. Poetry, and drama in particular, belonged to the imitative arts, forms defined by mimesis, or imitation. This meant that plays and poems worked by representing action, character, and life itself. Unlike medicine or navigation, their value lay not in producing cures or voyages, but in shaping our emotional and imaginative responses through shared representations. Tragedy was his primary focus, a theatrical form central to Greek civic life. These plays were more than just entertainment. They unified entire communities through shared experience. Aristotle wondered why audiences left tragedies feeling strangely uplifted after witnessing suffering and loss. His idea of catharsis, purification or cleansing, is explained. By observing fear and pity enacted on stage, audiences experienced a release that left them calmer and more balanced. However, he added nuance. The emotions stirred by tragedy were not raw pity and fear, but a kind of quasi-pity and quasi-fear. The safety of the theater provided a sense of distance. Viewers felt as though they genuinely experienced these emotions, but the context allowed them to derive pleasure from the process. Tragedy thus calibrated emotions, releasing them safely rather than leaving them buried or corrosive. He argued that this effect depended on structure. A tragedy cannot be a jumble of scenes. It needs a beginning, middle, and end, connected by necessity or probability. Characters must act in ways true to their nature. The climax must arise naturally from earlier choices, not from a sudden trick. Only then can catharsis function correctly, because emotions will build in response to ordered, recognizable patterns. An analogy makes the point clearer. Think of an architect designing a building. Walls and supports are carefully placed to ensure that people move safely and predictably through the structure. In the same way, Aristotle saw dramas built like architecture for emotion. The plot is the beam that carries the weight. The characters are the rooms we traverse. The resolution is the open space where tension is released. Just as built structures guide footsteps, dramatic structures guide emotional movement. By explaining this, Aristotle demonstrated that drama is not merely a form of recreation. It possesses civic value. Rhetoric shapes debates and decisions in legal courts and assemblies. Drama shapes emotion and moral imagination in the shared space of the theater. By analyzing narrative, he treated art as philosophy's partner rather than its luxury. In doing so, he gave form to a tradition where art is also instruction, capable of shaping individuals for community life. The influence of his work remains evident today. Orators, teachers, advertisers, and politicians continue, knowingly or not, to rely on ethos, pathos, and logos. Storytellers, from playwrights to filmmakers, still draw upon his theories when crafting plots. Scenes are structured with beginnings, climaxes, and resolutions that reflect his model. Additionally, the idea that audiences experience catharsis continues to shape criticism, analysis, and performance. His insights on imitation and tragedy remain fundamental references for understanding narrative art. A natural question arises. If you analyze poetry and rhetoric into structures, do you diminish their mystery? Isn't art meant to resist strict categorization? Aristotle was aware of this concern. However, he argued that analysis clarifies rather than diminishes the understanding. Understanding the grammar of a language does not prevent words from carrying poetry. It reveals how they achieve their power. Similarly, a structural analysis of plays and speeches explains why some inspire, persuade, or move us, rather than leaving these effects as unexplained surprises. It is also important to emphasize the boundaries of his definitions. His discussion of tragedy was based on examining the Greek theater of his era. Terms like tragedy were used descriptively, not prescriptively. His framework does not suggest that later writers, such as Shakespeare or Ibsen, failed to write tragedies, nor that prose tragedy is impossible. Instead, Aristotle provided a model derived from existing works. He identified what made those stories coherent and emotionally powerful for audiences in Athens, rather than what should be universal truths for all future ages. This viewpoint reinforces Aristotle's consistent linking of method to context. He maintained that rhetoric and poetics had appropriate roles in promoting truth and balance, but in each case, this power could also be misused. Speeches might inflame crowds without reason. Stories could distort rather than enlighten. For him, education served as a safeguard against the dangers of the world. If citizens were trained in rhetoric, they could recognize and resist manipulative appeals. If audiences understood the structure of sound art, they could detect when drama descended into chaos. Tools in the wrong hands corrupt, but properly taught tools strengthen. This was Aristotle's larger project again visible: systematic knowledge. Even words and art were structured, made usable as disciplines rather than left to instinct or chance. Rhetoric joined philosophy as the science of persuasion. Poetics joined philosophy as the analysis of representation and catharsis. Human communication, argument and storytelling alike, entered the grand design of knowledge alongside logic, metaphysics, and science. By the end of this part of his work, Aristotle had demonstrated that truth does not stand outside language, but depends on it. Reason must be expressed through credible speech. Emotion must be guided by artful narrative. A society's life is built on argument and story as much as on law or custom. In this way, his work in rhetoric and poetics provided enduring foundations. They remain cornerstones of communication and art, still guiding how people persuade, narrate, and share emotion. And from here, the view broadens. Step back from each branch: logic, science, psychology, ethics, politics, rhetoric, and poetics, and you observe what Aristotle achieved overall. His legacy was not only in discovery, but in building structures where every piece of knowledge had its place, fitted into a design strong enough to endure. Aristotle's achievement was to demonstrate that knowledge could be carefully organized. He compared it to constructing a house. Logic as the foundation, science as the walls, and art as the windows through which we see and feel. Even now, you move within that structure, often without recognizing it, because it still underpins the way thought, study, and explanation develop. The question is how you utilize this inheritance. Instead of scattered notes or poorly formed ideas, you can follow his example. Organize your learning, link each part, and build lasting frameworks. one thinker's vision continues to influence how we seek understanding today.